Some things don't make a sound when they call you, but the ones who listen still hear them. The first time Rex reacted, it was just past midnight, when the house had settled into that deep, breathing silence that only old wood could hold, the kind of silence that made every tick of the wall clock feel louder than it should, every shift of air feel like it carried a memory. Ethan Cole had only been back in the house for 3 hours, long enough to drag the armoire through the narrow front door, long enough to wipe the dust from its carved panels, long enough to sit in the dim glow of a single lamp and wonder how something so unwanted could feel so heavy in more ways than one. The armoire stood against the far wall, tall and narrow, just under 7 feet high, its dark oak surface worn smooth in places and splintered in others, the kind of piece people used to build when furniture wasn't meant to be replaced. His cousins had laughed when he chose it, shrugged it off like a joke that wasn't worth finishing, too busy arguing over cash accounts and property lines to notice the way Ethan had run his hand along its edge, the way he had paused for just a second longer than necessary. To them, it had been junk. To him, it had been the last thing in the room that still felt like her. The scent of cedar and old varnish lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the cold breath of early winter seeping through the cracked window frame, and for a while, nothing happened. Ethan sat in a worn armchair, boots still on, jacket folded over his lap, his eyes drifting between the armoire and the quiet shadows stretching across the floor. Rex lay near the door at first, head resting between his paws, ears relaxed, the picture of a dog at ease after a long drive. But then something shifted. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, not anything Ethan could name or place. It was more like a pause inside the silence itself, like the house had skipped a breath. Rex's ears twitched before anything else, lifting slowly as if catching a frequency just beyond reach. His head rose, amber eyes narrowing toward the far wall. Ethan noticed, but he didn't move. He had learned long ago not to interrupt the dog when that look came over him, that focused stillness that meant something was being measured, understood, processed in a way no human could quite follow. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, voice low, more out of habit than concern. Rex didn't answer, of course, but his body shifted, rising to his feet with a quiet, deliberate motion. His nails clicked softly against the hardwood as he took a few steps forward, then stopped again, just short of the armoire. The distance between them couldn't have been more than 3 feet, but it might as well have been something deeper, something unseen stretching between the dog and the wood. Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, watching. The lamplight flickered faintly, not enough to call it a problem, just enough to make the shadows move in ways that felt almost intentional. Rex tilted his head, listening, then took one more step. He lowered his nose toward the base of the armoire, inhaled slowly, then froze. It wasn't fear. Ethan knew what fear looked like in him, had seen it in harsher places than this. This was something else. Recognition, maybe? Or attention. The kind of attention that meant a pattern had been found. A low sound formed in Rex's chest, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something older than either. Ethan stood then, slow and careful, as if the air itself might crack if he moved too quickly. The floor creaked under his weight, a familiar sound that seemed out of place in the moment. He crossed the room, stopping just behind the dog, his gaze fixed on the same spot. "It's just an old cabinet," he said softly, though the words didn't carry much conviction. Rex didn't look back. Instead, he lifted one paw and placed it gently against the wood, right where the grain shifted slightly, where the color deepened just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Then he tapped once. A single, quiet knock. Ethan frowned, stepping closer. He reached out, pressing his palm flat against the surface. The wood felt cool, denser than it should have been, as if something lay just beyond it, something that didn't belong to the outer shell. He tapped lightly in the same spot. The sound that came back wasn't solid. It wasn't the dull thud of thick oak. It was hollow. Subtle, but unmistakable. Ethan's breath slowed, his mind shifting gears the way it used to when something didn't add up. He moved his hand a few inches to the left, tapped again. Solid. To the right. Hollow again. Rex stepped back, sitting now, eyes locked on Ethan as if waiting for him to catch up to something the dog had already accepted as truth. The room seemed to tighten around them, the air pulling inward, the quiet deepening into something that felt almost alive. Ethan ran his fingers along the seam, tracing the lines of the wood, searching for anything that didn't belong. And somewhere beneath his touch, beneath the layers of time and dust and silence, something answered, not with a sound he could hear, but with a certainty he could feel. This wasn't just an old piece of furniture. And whatever it was holding, had been waiting. The hollow sound did not leave him, even after he stepped back, even after he told himself it was just old wood settling the way old things sometimes did when they were moved for the first time in years. But Ethan Cole had learned, through years of listening to things most people ignored, that not every sound was meant to be dismissed, and not every silence was empty. He pressed his palm against the armoire again, slower this time, tracing the grain with a kind of patience that came from habit rather than curiosity, the kind that had once kept him steady in places where rushing meant missing what mattered. Rex remained seated, but his posture had changed, his back straight, ears forward, eyes locked not on Ethan now, but on the exact point where the man's hand rested. The dog did not blink. Ethan tapped the wood again, gently, then a little firmer, mapping the difference in tone with each inch he moved, until a pattern began to form beneath his fingertips, a boundary that should not have been there if the piece had been built the way it looked. "You hear that too, huh?" he said under his breath, though he knew Rex was not responding to the sound the same way he was. The lamp flickered again, a faint tremor in the filament that cast the room in a shifting amber glow, and for a moment, the carved panels of the armoire seemed deeper than before, the lines more pronounced, as if time itself had etched something into them that light alone could not fully reveal. Ethan crouched, lowering himself until his eyes were level with the midsection of the cabinet, where the hollow tone had been strongest. Up close, the wood told a different story. There were seams, but they were too clean, too intentional to be the result of age or wear. A craftsman's work. Hidden but not careless. He ran his thumb along one of the vertical ridges, feeling for irregularities, and there it was, a slight indentation, no wider than a fingernail, positioned where no decorative detail should have been. Rex stood then, stepping closer again, his nose brushing against Ethan's sleeve before moving toward the same spot. He exhaled slowly, a soft huff that fogged the surface for just a second before fading. "All right," Ethan whispered, more to himself than to the dog, and pressed his thumb into the indentation. Nothing happened. Not at first. The wood remained still, the room unchanged, the quiet pressing in around them like it had before. Ethan released the pressure, then tried again, this time holding it a second longer. There was a faint click, so soft it might have been imagined, but Rex reacted instantly, his head snapping upward, ears rigid. Ethan felt it then, not a movement, not exactly, but a shift in tension within the structure, as if something inside had loosened its hold after years of waiting. He leaned closer, his other hand moving to the side panel, testing for give. At first, it resisted, firm and unmoving, but then, with a careful pull, the section gave way by less than half an inch. That was all it took. Ethan paused, his breath steady but shallow, the kind that came when instinct said to move carefully, deliberately, without forcing what was meant to open on its own. He adjusted his grip and pulled again, and this time the panel slid outward just enough to reveal a narrow seam of darkness behind it. Dust drifted down in a thin line, catching the lamplight like faint ash suspended in the air. Rex let out a low sound again, softer this time, almost like recognition settling into place. Ethan widened the gap slowly, inch by inch, until the hidden compartment revealed itself, not large, not filled with anything that glimmered or shone, but deep enough to hold something of meaning. Inside, resting against the back, was a small wooden box, no larger than a shoebox, its surface smooth and lighter in color than the surrounding wood, as if it had been placed there long after the armoire itself had been built. For a moment, Ethan did not reach for it. He simply looked, taking in the shape, the stillness, the way it seemed untouched by time despite everything around it. Rex sat beside him now, closer than before, his shoulder brushing against Ethan's arm, steady and present in a way that felt grounding. "She knew," Ethan said quietly, the words forming before he had fully thought them through. It was not a conclusion drawn from logic alone. It was something deeper, something that had been building since he lifted the armoire from the corner of that crowded living room, since he chose it when no one else would. He reached in then, carefully, lifting the box with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, solid in a way that suggested purpose, not decoration. The lid was secured with a simple latch, no lock, no code, nothing to keep it closed except the decision to open it or not. Ethan ran his thumb along the edge, feeling the grain, the smoothness, the absence of dust that should have been there after all these years. Rex watched without moving, his gaze steady, his breathing slow and even. The house seemed quieter now, as if it, too, was waiting. Ethan exhaled, a long, measured breath, and lifted the latch. The latch lifted with a soft metallic whisper, a sound so small it almost felt out of place against the weight of everything that had led to this moment, and for a second Ethan did not move, his hand resting on the edge of the lid as if he understood that whatever waited inside was not just an object but a continuation of something that had already begun long before he ever stepped into this house. Rex shifted closer, his shoulder pressing lightly against Ethan's arm. Steady and warm, the only movement in a room that seemed to have drawn its breath and held it. Slowly, Ethan raised the lid. The hinges did not creak. They moved with a quiet smoothness that suggested care, not age, as if whoever had placed this box here had done so with intention and patience, expecting it to be opened not by chance, but by someone who would take the time to listen. Inside, there was no gold, no stacks of cash, nothing that flashed or shimmered in the lamplight. Instead, there was a folded envelope, thick and cream-colored, its edges slightly worn but not fragile, resting atop a set of neatly arranged documents bound together with a simple twine. The handwriting on the envelope stopped Ethan's breath for just a moment. It was hers. The same steady, careful script he remembered from birthday cards and small notes left on kitchen counters years ago. His name was written across the front in full, not rushed, not abbreviated, as if she had wanted to make sure it would be recognized even after everything else had faded. Ethan traced the letters with his thumb, a quiet gesture that carried more weight than he expected, then slid the envelope free from the box. Rex lowered his head slightly, watching, his eyes calm now, no longer searching, as if whatever had called his attention had already been fulfilled. Ethan opened the envelope carefully, easing the flap back without tearing it, and unfolded the letter inside. The paper made a soft sound as it opened, a whisper that seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. He read the first line, and something in his posture changed, not visibly to anyone else, but enough that Rex leaned in just a fraction closer. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then you chose what no one else wanted." Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes moving across the page, each word settling into place with a quiet certainty that felt less like surprise and more like recognition. She wrote about the day he visited her years ago, when no one else had, when he fixed the loose hinge on that same armoire without being asked, when he sat with her in the late afternoon light and listened to stories no one else had time for. She wrote about how people reveal themselves not when something is valuable, but when it appears to be worthless. And she wrote about trust, not as something given freely, but as something earned in small, unnoticed moments that most people forget. Ethan's grip on the letter tightened slightly as he reached the final lines, where her handwriting softened just a bit, the strokes less firm but no less deliberate. "What is inside this box is not the treasure," she wrote. "It is only the beginning. The rest will only open for someone who understands that value is not always where people are looking." Ethan lowered the letter slowly, his gaze drifting back to the box. The documents beneath the envelope were still bound, still untouched, waiting in the same quiet way everything else had. He set the letter aside with care, placing it on the small table beside him, then reached back into the compartment and lifted the stack free. The twine slipped loose with a gentle pull, revealing pages of legal text, printed clean and precise, alongside a smaller, weathered card tucked between them. Rex shifted again, his nose brushing lightly against Ethan's wrist before moving toward the card, his attention narrowing once more. Ethan noticed the change immediately. The dog's instincts had not faded. They had only paused. Ethan picked up the card, turning it over in his hand. On one side, there was nothing but a faint embossed seal, worn smooth by time. On the other, a set of numbers was written in the same careful handwriting as the letter, followed by a single word beneath them. Location. Ethan felt something settle into place in his mind, the kind of alignment that did not come from guessing but from understanding. This was not an inheritance in the way the rest of his family had imagined. This was a path. He looked back at Rex, who met his gaze with a calm steadiness that felt almost knowing, then back at the documents, then at the open armoire behind them, its hidden panel still ajar, its secret no longer hidden but far from fully revealed. Outside, the wind moved softly against the house, brushing along the siding like a distant memory, and for the first time since he arrived, the silence did not feel empty. It felt purposeful, as if something had finally begun. The numbers did not feel random, and the word beneath them did not feel like a suggestion. It felt like an instruction waiting patiently to be followed, the kind that did not demand urgency but carried a quiet certainty that it would be acted on by the right person at the right time. Ethan sat there for a long moment, the card resting in his palm, his thumb brushing lightly over the ink as if touch alone might reveal something more, but the meaning did not come from the surface. It settled deeper, in the same place that had told him to choose the armoire when everyone else had turned away. Rex shifted his weight and stood, his nails tapping softly against the floor, then walked toward the front door, pausing just long enough to look back at Ethan, not impatient, not restless, but expectant. Ethan let out a slow breath and nodded once, more to himself than to the dog, then rose to his feet, the documents still in his hand. The room behind him felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because something had begun to move forward. He gathered the letter, the papers, and the card, placing them carefully into his jacket pocket, then crossed to the door and opened it. The night air met him with a clean, steady cold, the kind that carried the scent of distant pine and damp earth, grounding in a way that sharpened thought rather than clouding it. Rex stepped out first, nose lifting to catch the wind, ears turning slightly as if aligning with something only he could hear. Ethan followed, closing the door behind him, and for a brief moment he glanced back through the window at the armoire standing in the dim light inside, its hidden panel still open, its purpose no longer finished but already fulfilled in part. The numbers echoed in his mind as he walked to the truck, each digit settling into place with a familiarity that grew stronger the more he considered it. Coordinates. Not an address, not a code meant for a lock, but a location meant to be found. He had seen numbers like this before, in different contexts, different places, but the pattern was unmistakable. He pulled the folded map from the glove compartment once he climbed into the driver's seat, spreading it across the steering wheel while Rex settled beside him, alert but calm. The dome light cast a soft glow over the paper, and Ethan traced the numbers with his finger, translating them carefully, methodically, until a point revealed itself just north of the county line, past a stretch of land that most people would not bother to visit, a place marked by little more than a faint outline of old property boundaries and a narrow access road that barely registered on newer maps. "You knew it would be out there," he said quietly, though he did not need to say who he meant. Rex glanced at him briefly, then back toward the road ahead. Ethan folded the map, started the engine, and let the truck idle for a second before pulling away, the headlights cutting through the darkness in a steady beam that stretched forward into the unknown. The drive was not long in miles, but it carried a different kind of distance, one measured not in time but in realization, in the slow unfolding of something that had been set in motion long before this night. The road narrowed as he turned off the main route, the pavement giving way to gravel, then to packed dirt, the truck moving more slowly now as the trees closed in on either side, their branches forming a loose canopy that filtered the faint light of the moon. Rex remained still, his posture forward, his focus fixed beyond the windshield, as if the path itself was already familiar to him. Ethan followed the map, counting the turns, matching the terrain to the lines and markings he had studied only minutes before, until the road ended in a small clearing no wider than 50 feet across, bordered by tall, silent trees. He cut the engine, and the sudden absence of its hum made the night feel deeper, more complete. For a moment, either of them moved. Then Rex stood, stepped down from the seat, and walked toward the edge of the clearing, stopping near a patch of ground that looked no different from the rest. He lowered his head, sniffed once, then pawed lightly at the earth, not digging, not forcing, just marking the spot. Ethan stepped out, the cold air's sharper here, the silence more pronounced, and walked over to where the dog stood. He looked down, then around, taking in the subtle details that might have gone unnoticed at a glance. The ground was slightly raised, just enough to suggest something beneath, something placed there with intention rather than left by chance. Ethan knelt, brushing away a thin layer of leaves and dirt with his hand, revealing the edge of a metal surface just beneath. It was not large, not obvious, but it was there, waiting. Rex sat beside him again, quiet now, his role shifting from guide to witness. Ethan rested his hand on the metal, feeling the cold, the solidity, the confirmation of everything that had led him here. And in that moment, standing in the stillness of a place no one else had chosen to look, he understood that the armoire had never been the destination. It had only been the door. The metal surface did not give under his hand, but it did not feel like resistance either. It felt like something waiting to be acknowledged, the way a locked door feels different when you know you already have the key. Ethan brushed away more of the dirt, clearing a rectangle roughly 3 feet by 2, the edges defined by a thin seam that ran just beneath the surface, too precise to be natural. Rex leaned forward slightly, his nose hovering just above the metal, his breathing slow and steady, no longer searching, only confirming. "All right," Ethan said quietly, his voice carried away by the stillness of the trees, and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the small card again. The numbers had led him here, but the word beneath them had not yet fully revealed itself. Location. Not just where to go, but where to begin. He turned the card over once more, studying it under the pale moonlight, and this time he noticed something he had missed before, a faint indentation near the edge, similar to the one hidden in the armoire. His thumb pressed against it instinctively, and there was a soft, internal shift within the card itself, a subtle click that barely registered as sound but carried a definite change. A thin metal strip slid out from the side, no more than 2 inches long, narrow, and flat, like a key designed not for a lock, but for a mechanism that required precision rather than force. Ethan exhaled slowly, a quiet acknowledgement that the path was unfolding exactly as it had been meant to. He looked back down at the metal panel in the ground and scanned its surface more carefully. At first glance, it appeared seamless, but as his eyes adjusted, he caught the faint outline of a slot, nearly invisible unless the light struck it at just the right angle. He positioned the strip over it, hesitated for just a moment, then slid it in. The fit was exact. There was no resistance, no need to adjust or force. The strip settled into place as if it belonged there, and when Ethan pressed down gently, the mechanism responded with a deeper click, one that resonated faintly through the ground beneath his knees. Rex's ears lifted at the sound, his body leaning forward just slightly, attentive but calm. The panel shifted then, not abruptly, but with a slow, controlled movement, rising just enough at one edge to create a narrow gap. Cold air escaped from below, carrying with it a faint scent of stone and something older, something that had been sealed away from the open world for a very long time. Ethan removed the metal strip and set it carefully on the ground beside him, then placed both hands under the lifted edge of the panel and raised it further. The weight was significant, heavier than it looked, but balanced in a way that suggested it had been designed to be opened by one person who knew what they were doing. As the panel rose, it revealed a set of steps descending into darkness, the interior lined with smooth concrete walls that reflected just enough moonlight to outline the path downward. Ethan paused at the top, looking into the space, letting his eyes adjust, letting his instincts catch up to what his senses were telling him. Rex stood, stepped closer, then looked up at Ethan, waiting. Not urging, not warning, just present in the way he always had been when something important stood ahead. "We go together," Ethan said, a quiet promise more than a plan, and reached back into the truck for the flashlight he kept behind the seat. The beam cut. cleanly through the darkness when he switched it on, revealing the steps more clearly now, each one intact, evenly spaced, leading down perhaps 10 feet before turning out of sight. He descended slowly, one step at a time, the sound of his boots muted against the concrete, the air growing cooler with each step. Rex followed close behind, his movement silent despite his size, his presence steady at Ethan's side. At the bottom, the space opened into a small chamber, no more than 12 feet by 12, the walls reinforced, the floor clean, untouched by the kind of decay that would have been expected after so many years. At the center of the room stood a single object, placed with deliberate care. It was a safe, larger than the box from the armoire but not oversized, constructed of steel with a matte finish that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. There was no visible handle, no keypad, no traditional lock. Only a narrow slot, identical in shape to the metal strip now resting in Ethan's hand. He stepped closer, the beam of the flashlight steady, his breathing even, his thoughts quiet in a way that came only when everything aligned. Rex stopped just behind him, sitting once more, his gaze fixed on the safe as if the journey had led exactly where it was meant to. Ethan held the strip for a moment, feeling its weight, its purpose, then raised it toward the slot. The silence in the room deepened, not empty, but full, as if something had been waiting here not for years, but for the right person to arrive and understand what to do next. The metal strip hovered for a fraction of a second before Ethan guided it into the narrow slot, and the moment it slid into place, the air in the chamber seemed to shift, not dramatically, but enough to be felt rather than heard, like a quiet agreement being fulfilled after a long wait. He did not force it. He pressed forward with steady pressure, and the mechanism accepted it with a clean, internal click that echoed softly through the concrete walls. Rex remained still behind him, his breathing slow, his attention unwavering, as if the outcome had already been decided long before this moment. Ethan kept his hand on the strip. Waiting, listening, the same way he had learned to wait when timing mattered more than action. Then the safe responded. Not with a sudden release, but with a controlled movement, a deep internal shift followed by a low, measured hum that faded almost as quickly as it began. A seam appeared along the front of the safe, barely visible at first, then widening just enough to reveal that the door had unlocked. Ethan withdrew the strip carefully and stepped back half a pace, giving the mechanism space as the door eased open on its own, slow and deliberate, as if whatever lay inside was not meant to be rushed into the open world. The beam of the flashlight fell across the interior, and for a moment, there was nothing that resembled the expectation his family would have had, no stacks of bills, no glittering display of wealth, only order, structure, and something far more intentional. Inside the safe were rows of sealed document cases, each labeled with precise, typed markings, along with a series of small, secure containers arranged in a way that spoke of planning rather than accumulation. Ethan stepped closer, lowering the flashlight slightly to take in the details. The labels were not random. They bore names of institutions, account references, legal designations, and dates that stretched back years, even decades. This was not hidden money in the simple sense. This was something structured, something maintained, something that had been built carefully over time. Rex shifted again, his head tilting slightly, not in confusion, but in observation, as if the nature of what had been found required a different kind of understanding. Ethan reached in and lifted one of the document cases, feeling the weight of it, not just physically, but in what it represented. He opened it slowly, revealing a set of official papers, stamped and signed, detailing holdings, trusts, and asset accounts connected across multiple states, even beyond. The numbers were there, but they were not displayed as something to be admired. They were recorded, accounted for, organized with precision. Ethan's eyes moved across the figures, and for a brief moment, the scale of it tried to settle in, but it did not overwhelm him. It simply confirmed what had already been implied. This was the $270 million his family had never seen, never known, never even considered looking for, because it had never been placed where they would think to search. He set the documents back with care and reached for another container, this one smaller, secured with a simple latch. Inside was another letter, folded with the same deliberate attention as the first. Ethan paused, then opened it, the paper unfolding with that same soft, familiar sound. Her handwriting greeted him again, steady and clear. "If you have come this far," it read, "then you have already proven that you see beyond what is given at the surface. This was never about money. It was about who would take the time to understand where it truly rests." Ethan read on, his expression unchanged but his focus deepening with every word. She explained how the assets had been built quietly, how they had been placed where they would not attract attention, and how she had watched her family over the years, not with judgment, but with understanding. "They looked at what could be taken," she wrote, "but you looked at what remained." Rex lowered himself to the floor beside Ethan, resting but alert, his presence grounding in a way that required no words. The letter continued, explaining that the structure of everything inside the safe could only be accessed, transferred, or used through the documents now in Ethan's hands. Nothing here could be claimed by anyone who had not followed the path. Nothing could be taken without knowing where to begin. Ethan folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the container, then stood there for a moment in the quiet chamber, the open safe before him, the weight of it all settled not on his shoulders, but within his understanding. This was not a reward for luck. It was a result of choice. He turned slightly, glancing back at Rex, who met his gaze with that same calm, steady look. "You found it first," Ethan said quietly, and though the dog did not respond in any way that could be measured, there was something in the stillness that felt like agreement. Above them, the night continued in silence. Unaware of what had been uncovered below, and for the first time since the journey began, Ethan understood that nothing here had been hidden by accident. It had been waiting for someone who would not overlook what others were too busy to see. The chamber did not feel like a place meant to hold wealth in the way most people imagined it. It felt more like a place designed to protect intention, to preserve something that required understanding before it could be used, and Ethan stood there for a long moment, the open safe before him, the quiet pressing in around him like a presence that did not demand but simply existed. He reached in again, this time selecting one of the thicker document cases, its label marked with a series of identifiers that suggested something more immediate, something active rather than archived. The case opened with a soft release, revealing a set of folders arranged with careful precision, each one containing structured records that spoke not just of ownership, but of responsibility. As Ethan turned the pages, he began to see the shape of what had been built, not just accounts and numbers, but properties held in trust, businesses quietly sustained, land preserved rather than sold, all connected through a network that had been managed with intention rather than display. This was not just inheritance. It was stewardship. Rex shifted slightly, rising to his feet and moving a few steps closer to the safe, his nose hovering near the lower section, where another compartment rested beneath the main shelf. He paused there, then tapped once with his paw, the same deliberate motion he had used before, not random, not restless, but precise. Ethan noticed immediately, and lowered himself again, adjusting the beam of the flashlight to follow the dog's attention. "There is more," he murmured, not as a question, but as a recognition of the pattern that had already proven itself. He reached toward the lower compartment, finding a small recessed handle that blended almost seamlessly into the interior wall. With a gentle pull, the panels slid outward, revealing a second, more compact section hidden beneath the first. Inside, there were no stacks of documents, no rows of cases, but a single, rectangular box, darker in tone, its surface unmarked except for a small engraved line along the top. Ethan lifted it carefully, feeling its weight, then set it on the floor beside him before opening it. The lid revealed a series of items placed with intention, each one separate, each one carrying its own significance. There was a small key, different from the metal strip, more traditional but crafted with unusual detail. There was a slim, leather-bound notebook, its cover worn but well preserved, and beneath it, another letter, folded with the same care as the others. Rex sat beside him again, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, his presence steady, his attention focused not on the objects themselves, but on the process unfolding. Ethan picked up the notebook first, opening it slowly. The pages inside were filled with handwriting, not formal like the letters, but personal, reflective, entries written over time. He read a few lines, and the tone shifted immediately. These were not instructions. These were thoughts, observations, records of decisions made and reasons behind them. She had documented not just what she built, but why she built it the way she did, explaining how certain properties had been preserved to protect communities, how certain investments had been structured to remain unnoticed while still supporting something larger than profit. Ethan closed the notebook gently, understanding that this was not something to be read quickly, but something to be learned from over time. He then unfolded the letter beneath it, his eyes moving across the familiar script once more. "If you have found this," it began, "then you have already seen what most people never do. Not because it was hidden, but because they were not looking in the right way." Ethan felt a quiet shift within himself as he read, not surprise, not disbelief, but a steady alignment with something that had been forming since the moment he chose the Armoire. She wrote about legacy, not as something passed down, but as something entrusted. "This was never meant to be owned," she wrote. "It was meant to be carried forward." The words settled into the space around him, into the silence, into the understanding that what he had uncovered was not an ending, but a beginning that required something from him in return. Rex exhaled softly, lowering himself to the floor, his head resting on his paws, calm now, as if the path had reached a point of clarity. Ethan folded the letter and placed it back into the box, then looked once more at everything laid out before him, the documents, the notebook, the key, each piece part of something larger than any single discovery. He stood slowly, turning back toward the open safe, then toward the steps leading up, the night waiting above just as it had before, unchanged, unaware. But Ethan was not the same as when he had first descended. He reached down and rested his hand briefly on Rex's head, a quiet acknowledgement, then gathered the items carefully, securing them before preparing to leave the chamber. And as he took that first step toward the stairs, the realization settled fully into place, not as a sudden thought, but as something steady and certain. The value of what he had found was not measured in numbers alone. It was measured in what he chose to do next. The climb back up felt different than the descent, not heavier, not rushed, but grounded in a way that carried purpose with each step, and as Ethan emerged into the open air once more, the night seemed wider than before, the sky stretching above the clearing with a quiet clarity that made every star feel closer than it had when he first arrived. Rex stepped out beside him, pausing at the edge of the opening, his ears lifting as he scanned the trees, then settling as if confirming that nothing here had changed, only them. Ethan set the items carefully in the truck before turning back, lowering the metal panel into place with the same steady control he had used to open it, making sure it rested flush with the ground, hidden again beneath the thin layer of earth and leaves, just as it had been before, as if the world was not meant to notice what lay beneath it. The card and the metal strip returned to his pocket, not as tools anymore, but as reminders of the path that had brought him here. For a moment he stood in the clearing, looking out into the trees, the stillness holding a different kind of meaning now, not empty, not forgotten, but protected. Rex moved closer, brushing against his leg, then turned toward the truck, ready to move on, not out of restlessness, but out of understanding that what needed to be found had already been found. The drive back was quieter than before, not because the road had changed, but because Ethan's thoughts had settled into something steady, something clear. The gravel shifted beneath the tires in a familiar rhythm, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness, and beside him, Rex rested with his head up, eyes open, alert in the calm way he always was when the world felt right. Ethan glanced at him once, a small, almost unnoticeable smile touching his expression before fading back into quiet focus. "You knew," he said softly, not expecting an answer, but acknowledging something that did not need to be explained. When the house came back into view, its windows dim against the night, it no longer felt like a place he had returned to by chance. It felt like part of something that had already been set in motion. Inside, the air was still warm from earlier, the lamp casting the same soft glow across the room, and the armoire stood where he had left it, its hidden panel still slightly open, a silent reminder that everything had begun there. Ethan set the items down on the table, removing his jacket and placing it over the chair, then crossed the room and gently pushed the panel back into place. It clicked softly, sealing the compartment as if it had never been disturbed, but the presence of it remained, not as a secret, but as a beginning point that had already fulfilled its role. Rex moved through the room slowly, pausing near the armoire once more, then turning away without hesitation, his task complete, his focus shifting to the present rather than what had already been uncovered. Ethan returned to the table and opened the notebook again, flipping through a few more pages, letting the words settle, not rushing to understand everything at once, but allowing the meaning to unfold naturally. There were entries about decisions made quietly, about choosing to preserve rather than take, about recognizing value in places others ignored. Each line carried a tone of calm certainty, not pride, not regret, just clarity. Ethan closed the notebook and looked at the documents beside it, then at the small key resting on top. He picked it up, turning it between his fingers, feeling its weight, its purpose still not fully revealed, another step waiting ahead. Rex settled near the door, lying down with a slow exhale, his body relaxed, his presence steady, as if the journey had reached a point of pause rather than an end. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, brushing against the house with a gentle sound that no longer felt distant. Ethan leaned back in the chair, his eyes drifting toward the armoire one last time before returning to the table, to the items before him, to the quiet understanding that had settled into place. Nothing about this had been accidental. Not the armoire. Not the letter. Not the path. And certainly not the choice he had made when he took something everyone else had left behind. He rested his hand lightly on the notebook, then on the documents, not claiming them, but acknowledging them, the same way one acknowledges responsibility rather than ownership. Rex shifted slightly, his tail giving a slow, quiet thump against the floor, the only sound in the room. And in that stillness, Ethan understood something that could not be written in any document, or measured in any account. The real inheritance had never been hidden in the safe. It had been in the way it was meant to be found, and in the kind of person willing to follow that path all the way through. Morning did not arrive all at once. It eased into the room slowly, a pale light stretching across the wooden floor, softening the edges of everything it touched, and when Ethan opened his eyes, it took him a moment to remember where he was, not because he had forgotten, but because something about the quiet had changed, settling deeper than it had the night before. Rex was already awake, lying near the door with his head lifted, watching the light as it crept across the room, his ears relaxed, his posture calm in a way that suggested the world had returned to balance. Ethan sat up in the chair, the notebook still resting near his hand, the documents stacked neatly beside it, and for a moment he simply looked at them, not with urgency, not with disbelief, but with a steady understanding that what had been placed in front of him was no longer hidden, and no longer waiting. He rose slowly, stretching slightly, then crossed to the window, looking out at the trees beyond the yard, their branches still, their shadows long in the early light. Nothing out there had changed. The same gravel road, the same quiet stretch of land, the same sky opening above it all. But inside something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Rex stood and walked over, stopping beside him, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, grounding him in the present. "We are still here," Ethan said softly, not as a question, but as a reminder that whatever came next would begin exactly where he stood. He turned back toward the table, picking up the small key again, rolling it once between his fingers, feeling the shape of it, the weight, the purpose that had not yet fully revealed itself. It did not feel urgent. It did not demand to be used immediately. It simply existed as the next step when the time was right. Ethan set it down carefully, then gathered the documents, organizing them with the same quiet precision he had seen in the chamber below. There was no rush in his movements, no sign of someone overwhelmed by what he had found. Instead, there was a calm that came from understanding that value, when it is real, does not need to be chased. It needs to be carried. He opened the notebook again, this time reading further, letting the entries guide him through decisions that had been made long before he was ever part of the picture. There were notes about helping people quietly, about protecting land from being stripped for short-term gain, about building something that would not collapse the moment attention turned away. And as he read, he began to see not just what had been created, but why it had been left to him. Rex moved to the armoire once more, standing in front of it for a brief second, then turning away without pause, as if acknowledging that its role had been completed, that it no longer needed to call attention to itself. Ethan noticed, and a faint understanding settled deeper. The signs had stopped because the path had been found. He closed the notebook and rested both hands on the table, looking down at everything before him, then lifting his gaze toward the quiet room, the same room that had held nothing more than an old piece of furniture the night before. He did not think about the people who had laughed, who had chosen differently, who had walked away from something they never even realized was there. There was no bitterness in him, no need to return or prove anything. That part of the story had already ended. Instead, his thoughts moved forward, not in leaps, but in steady steps, considering what needed to be done, what could be protected, what could be continued without changing the nature of what it was meant to be. He gathered the documents and placed them into a simple case, not to hide them again, but to carry them properly, to treat them as something that required care rather than display. Rex lay down near the door once more, his eyes half closed, his breathing even, the quiet presence of a companion who had done what he was meant to do without ever needing recognition. Ethan stepped outside then, the morning air crisp, the light clearer now, stretching across the land in a way that made everything feel open, possible, and grounded at the same time. He stood there for a moment, taking it in, not searching for anything else, not expecting another sign. There was nothing more to uncover. Only something to live out. He looked down at Rex, who had followed him out, standing beside him with the same steady calm, and gave a small nod. "We keep it going," he said quietly, the words carrying no weight of burden, only purpose. The wind moved gently through the trees, not as a warning, not as a call, but as a simple presence that had always been there, unnoticed until someone chose to listen. And as Ethan stood there, with the morning fully arrived and the path no longer hidden, he understood something that could not be written in any letter or stored in any safe. Some things are not given to be owned. They are given to be continued by the ones who never needed to be told their value in the first place.